Y'all ready for your history?
Get started.
Welcome.
Hi.
Hello, everyone.
To the Pro Audio Suite, thanks to RØDE microphones.
These guys are professional. They're motivated.
Introducing Robert Marshall from Source Elements and Someone Audio Post, Chicago. Darren Robbo Robertson from Voodoo Radio Imaging, Sydney. Tech to the VO stars, George the Tech Whittam from LA. And me, Andrew Peters, voiceover talent and home studio guy.
Line up, ladies!
Here we go.
Welcome to another Pro Audio Suite. Don't forget, we are on Patreon. It is Patreon/Pro Audio Suite. I think that's the address. Is that right, Robbo?
That's us.
Beautiful.
Indeed.
Every penny counts.
Yes, please.
Does indeed. Now, you had a strange file sent to you the other day, Robbo.
Yeah, no names, no pack drill. I won't even tell too much of the story, but I received an audio file from another home studio, something that they'd recorded, and it was full of little digital pops and clicks. And when I asked the question via email, was there some issue with the recording, I got the message back that my computer's been doing that for a while and I can't figure out why.
Very handy.
Very handy if you're making your living off using a microphone in your home studio. I would have thought not. So consequently, the file didn't get used and they didn't get paid. So I kind of thought it might be an interesting little topic for us to have a chat about this week, because from time to time, even I get those sort of things happening. Sometimes it's not even induced by your system. Sometimes it just comes from the nature of working with digital audio. So I kind of thought it
What's
might be
What's the main reason that would happen, though?
Well, I know in my setup, but Robert, you're dealing with a bunch of different people. What's the most common cause that you see?
It's hard to know the exact, what is the most common, but a very common one, and the first one I would think is what's called the clock mismatch. So, for example, you have a analog to digital converter, and let's say that you're passing your audio into your audio interface via a digital connection. It could be AES or SPDIF, or even within the computer, there's still a digital connection. First conversion is, say, at 44.1, but the workstation is running at 48. They're not going to line up. And what you can imagine is two cog wheels that are supposed to mesh together, but the spacings between the cogs don't really line up. So they kind of line up, and then eventually they get bound up and they kind of snap, and then they line up again, or they kind of work together and then they snap. And that's what those clicks are, those periodic. Often they're periodic, but they can be random, and it's essentially either a clock mismatch or two clocks that maybe they're at the same rate, but even two clocks that are counting at, say, 48K, they might not be counting at the exact same version of 48K. In other words, the concept or the length of time of 1 second to one converter is not exactly the same length of time to the other converter. So even though their cog wheels might be closer matched, they still miss every now and then. So when you're connecting digital audio equipment, a very important concept is the idea of locking the clocks together. And you might have heard of a thing called word clock, for example. Blackburst is another version of a clock. Blackburst is a video clock. In the video world, the same thing happens where you get lines rolling across the screen and things like that, causing the frames not to line up. With a common clock system like a word clock or loop sync, basically what you're doing is you're saying one clock within my studio is the master and everyone else will follow that. Or another way that you can get someone to follow your clock is say, hey, I'm sending an AES or a SPDIF signal, and you follow the clock that's coming directly in on that audio signal. But however it goes, you have to have one master and everyone else is running to the beat of that one master. Because if not, you have the orchestra playing with multiple conductors and it doesn't line up. So that's one place where clocking errors will cause those snaps and clicks like that.
That's a good analogy of the way the clock works. The other way I heard it is the clock is like the drummer in the band. It keeps everybody else in time.
Yeah, or the conductor in the orchestra. Yeah. It's very much like the cog wheels if you imagine those line up. And if they don't line up, because one clock is, the spacing between the cogs is different. So they try to line up, and when they don't, they grind.
So how would you? So if someone was having a problem like that in their home studio, where they're probably not going to have a sync clock running. How would you fix that then? How would you deal with that?
So if the studio's simpler and there probably isn't some sort of complex digital audio clock and you're not feeding it in digitally, it can come from a problem with the drivers. It might still be a root sample clock, but I would look at the drivers to make sure that the drivers are installed correctly, that the audio interface is happy. Essentially, I'd look at that, because a lot of those errors that you get with like a poor USB connection or something like that can sound very similar, because I think they do come down to the same root cause of just timing. Essentially, what causes these clicks is timing errors, is really what it boils down to.
So it drops some zeros and ones, doesn't it, basically?
Yeah, well, it's all zero. It's all like, a rhythm, and it wants a picture in a very consistent cadence. And then when it skips a picture, imagine you're like jumping ahead in a film. So if you look at someone walking down the street and you skip a few frames, the pace of their walking will look funny because you just skipped a few, like their leg all of a sudden instantly moved forward. And so if you zoom into these waveforms, you'll literally see it go up, 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 and all of a sudden instantly it's down below. And nothing in reality can move that quickly. So, and then that's where the click is, because the speaker can't move that fast even. Sometimes if you're really in a pickle, and you have the right program, you can draw with a mouse. You can try to redraw the waveform and try to smooth it out. And you might not get rid of it completely, but you'll usually minimize it to some degree. That's a lot of work.
Isotope, declick, and depop do a good job of that too.
It's funny because I had a similar sound problem, and it turned out, in fact, it's happened twice. 2 different microphones I've had that had a similar clicking noise. I think one of them I sent to you, Robbo.
Yeah, I remember that.
From memory. Yeah. And there was one years ago that I had a similar issue with, took it back and they just replaced it. But it was bizarre and it sounded like a clocking kind of click. Really weird. But it turned out to be the microphone.
Yeah, it's a very distinctive sound. It's a
snap. It's the quickest snap.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's usually when a mic goes bad, it's a capacitor and you get that fried egg kind of sound out of it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So another place that pops and clicks can happen from, and they might not be in the audio file initially, but imagine you've got a low frequency rumble going on in the background. It might be so low that you don't even hear it in your signal, which means that when there's utter silence, it should be at 0. But really, when there's utter silence, for some reason, your computer's recording a flat line at, say, 1 or 10 decibels up. So you're not symmetrically going around 0, you're offset up or down. So what happens is when you're editing, and imagine you cut the waveform, and you don't put a fade on the beginning of that waveform. So now when it comes in, it's not coming in on a nice 0 crossing, what's called, where it ramps up smoothly. Instead, it just crashes into this either low frequency rumble that's up or down someplace, or the DC offset where it's up or down. And so you hear it click on all the edits. And that's why, Robbo, you and I were just talking about like, hey, I throw a 10 millisecond fade on everything when I'm done. I've seen the same thing happen with people running an old TV set in the background before, if it was a CRT, and it had that really high frequency sound at like 14K, and some people wouldn't hear it. And that's just enough signal sitting there in the background that if you're cutting across it and crash into that little signal.
Yeah, I've had that happen many times actually.
If you're doing your crossfades in Pro Tools, just remember to check that do not change existing fades is ticked.
Yes.
I don't know how many times I've done that. I've highlighted the whole session because my process is at the end of the session I just highlight everything, and I know that my existing setting for any cross or any fade is 13 milliseconds. I just hit F and it just puts a fade on everything. But the amount of times I've had, it had do not adjust existing fades not ticked, and I've gone to start mixing and I've listened to it and I've gone, what happened to that fade? And then I've realized what I've done. Trick for young players.
I mean, it's funny. There was a setting in Pro Tools that had an automatic fade on everything. And that used to cause other problems because I would do music edits, but then in every music edit, you'd get a quick fade down and a quick fade up, which wasn't a click, but it'd create a sound of its own. And that wasn't a great setting either.
No. So I think they've
like
tried,
you want fades when you want them.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, it was a nice idea, but it's like, You can't just arbitrarily say every time fade up and fade down. You have to
set it up yourself and do it manually.
Yeah.
Yep.
I did see there's a, I can't think of the name of it, but there's a new, it's not new, but there's a software out there that you can program to do a number of processes all in the touch of one button. And I know it works with Pro Tools and it runs off your iPad. So instead of doing...
like a macro?
Yeah, so it runs a macro.
Like a macro.
And I've never used it, but I'm just wondering whether you could...
I think it's called Stream Deck.
That's the one. So I'm wondering whether you could set that up to every time I make a cut, I want you to put a fade on the beginning and the end. That'd be interesting.
I bet you definitely could.
Or, or trim or something like that, yeah.
Mm-hmm. I just thought of another place where pops and clicks come from. Andrew would be very familiar with this. And that would be, you've recorded your voice onto vinyl.
That would be acetate.
Of course I would. Yes, that's right. Yes.
It really does sound better.
Well, that was fun. Is it over?
The Pro Audio Suite recorded using Rode NTG5s and Source Connect. Edited by Andrew Peters and mixed by Voodoo Radio Imaging. With tech support from George the Tech Whittam. Help us share the show with more people and get your hands on exclusive content by contributing to our Patreon page. See patreon.com/Pro Audio Suite. Don't forget to subscribe to the show and join in the conversation on our Facebook group. To leave a comment, suggest a topic, or just say g'day, drop us a note at our website, proaudiosuite.com.